All right, well, thanks. Keegan's presentation was actually really interesting to me, and I think we're gonna find that there's some similar concepts that we're gonna talk about for the types of fields and plantings that he was referring to with our presentation. So first of all, I want to introduce my colleague Nancy, who's getting at the back here. Nancy and I are both based in Edmonton with this organization called Cows and Fish. So I'm going to spend the next little bit chatting about how riparian areas can help get us through some of these drier times, but also help us get us through some of the higher moisture times as well. And as we all know, we're seeing some differences in the way that weather and climate is coming at us these days. And so hopefully we can build some of these natural systems into people's operations to help them be more resilient. I also want to thank Farming Forward for having us here. And I want to thank you for taking your time to come and spend with us. So first, a little bit about Cows and Fish. We are a not-for-profit organization working in Alberta. As I mentioned, or if I didn't, Nancy and I are both based in Edmonton, so we're the closest riparian specialists to you. We've been working in the province on these riparian landscapes since about 1992. And ultimately, our goal is to work with those that are making decisions on the land to provide better information or more information or different information to help get the best sort of results from your operations. So there are a lot of different sort of audiences that we can bring this riparian message to. So obviously with the name Cows and Fish, we might have a link to agriculture, and that is true. We actually started out with the ranch community in southwestern Alberta, who were literally ranchers were literally looking for different types of information to help them maintain their grazing lands and their fish populations. So not one or the other, but both. But because riparian areas are not limited to just grazing lands, they're all across the province, and they're all types of different impacts that are affecting them. So urban development, rural, acreage development, recreation, livestock grazing, other agricultural practices as well. So our approach is about bringing people information so that you can figure out what might work best for your operations, and also sort of facilitate some teams and tools that you might need to help get you going. So I've said the word riparian a couple of times. Is that a familiar word to you folks? Yeah, good, excellent. So this slide will go quick. The transition zones between aquatic and upland, present around streams, rivers, as well as lakes and wetlands. So your flowing water and your moving and your standing water. And we like to just kind of call them wetter than dry, but drier than wet. Right? They're those zones that sometimes have a lot of water, sometimes don't, that we can see, but always influenced by that water, the plants and the soils. So these riparian areas are we kind of have a affinity for these things. We've been working on them for 30 years and think they're pretty important. We know that they're dynamic, they're resilient, and they're unique because of that connection to water. So the landscape is the water's not always there, but you're going to see the results of the influence of that water through the plants and through the soils. And they are ecological powerhouses by providing flood and drought protection, wildlife and biodiversity habitat, cleaner water, regulating how much water we actually have in the ground, and also providing forage. So one of the things we can particularly count on with riparian areas is that they're going to change. They're dynamic. And they can change within a season, or they can change within years. This is a southern Alberta wetland. If the image is okay for you guys, you can see that pretty clear? It's okay? Yeah. Okay. Just literally changing throughout about time. Sometimes they're dry, sometimes they're wet, and we want you to, it's important to keep that in mind when thinking about where riparian areas fit into your operations. So we often get asked, well, where is my riparian area? And as all things kind of related to nature, the answer is it depends. There's no set exact number that it's 30 or 50 or 10 or 100 meters away from the water body. It's gonna depend on the type of landscape that you're in. But really what it comes down to is the influence of topography, moisture on the soils, and where those plants are gonna be unique and wanna keep their feet wet. So whether groundwater or surface water influenced, the riparian areas tend to be more lush. And in the south, sometimes this, we make fun of our southern colleagues and say that this is a really easy job for them. Because they just wait until the grass dries up and you know where the riparian is, because the riparian area is, because it's the only thing that's green. Up here, it becomes a little more difficult, particularly with peatlands and muskates and things like that as well. But there are definitely zones of influence around those water bodies that are going to influence that productivity and the soils. So riparian areas are important not only for all the wild things and the natural things, but they also are beneficial to the agriculture industry, as well as things like tourism, recreation. If you're going to go bird watching, where do you often go? Along the river or around the wetland. So a healthy functioning riparian area contributes to a bunch of different elements of our society, from economics, culture, environmental, and social, and also leads to resiliency, improved ecological services, and stability for us to be able to ride some of these waves that we're going to be faced with. So with that riparian area, like we're saying, they do all these great things and they're powerhouses, but how is it that they're doing that? And part of it is through the interaction of the plants, the soil, and the water, is they're performing these riparian functions. So things like trapping and storing sediment, building and maintaining banks, right? Creating trees and shrubs and grasses that little things and big things can grow in, as well as carbon sequestration. So when a riparian area is healthy and functioning, all these things are happening together, and they are ultimately providing us with all the outputs of that. So the ability to grow things, the ability to see birds, the ability to store water in the soil, to provide places for cleaner water as well. And if we look at just where the boxes showed up, these are all the pieces that are related to drought mitigation. So when healthy and functioning, riparian areas can help us with all those things. So speaking about the riparian areas having superpowers, there's been a recent study out of Saskatchewan that showed that 10 wetlands, 1 hectare in size each, removed more nutrients in the water than 1 wetland, 10 hectares in size. So if we're thinking about, all the little potholes that are out there that sometimes can be a bane in some people's sides, having more of them is showing to be more important from a water quality perspective than just having 1 big one. So when I think about what wetlands can do, what our streams and rivers can do, there are a whole bunch of different elements that we want people to think about. Everything from, mitigating temperature fluctuations to providing wildfire rates, right? Wetter soils, wetter vegetation should burn less intense. Providing that resiliency, having that diversity, sort of what Keegan was talking about, but in a different way, provides us that resiliency to flood, drought, pests, disease. Some plants are going to respond to certain pests, others are going to be okay with them, same with disease. And then recovery potential is still high and occurs quickly when pieces are in place. And there's some other research out there that was shown for the prairie pothole region, just thinking about the temperature fluctuations, that there was a cooling effect of 1 to 3 degrees in summer temperatures where wetlands were abundant in our prairie pothole region. So thinking about evaporation, where moisture is going to be, if we've got more wetlands, we should have cooler temperatures, and that can have a cooling effect, less evaporation, all those other things. So the other piece is around, water storage. So Keegan talked about soils being able to hold and store water. Riparian areas do that do a similar thing. By being able to snake their way across the landscape, rivers and streams are dissipating the energy that they have, which means that that water moves slower, transports less sediments, and doesn't have as much erosive power. And then having the vegetation there, holding things in place, they also act like a trap and a filter for anything that it might happen to be moving, including sediments as well as nutrients. So healthier riparian areas are going to do a lot of these functions better than ones that are unhealthy. So what's a healthy riparian area look like? Well, similar to a pasture or even a multi-species crop, it's going to have lots of different things in it. It's going to have grasses, talls and short ones. It's going to have trees and shrubs, talls and short ones, particularly all adapted to growing in those wetter soils. So sedges, in the wettest part of the wetland, willows around the edge, and then trees and shrubs in the back. Other situations have water disturbance caused plants, invasive species, or no species at all. I think intuitively, I would like to think that we see that there's an innate difference in these two photographs, which are literally just across the fence from one another, that the one on the left is going to perform less functions, or not as well, those functions, than the one on the right. So part of our work too is to, tune people's eyes to some of these different things and think about, how did that, partly how did that site get to that point on either healthier or unhealthier? And then what is making it that way, and what might we do to maintain or improve it? So I think we're talking about water, and I think you guys are gonna know the answer to this, but we'll do a little audience interaction participation piece. Which of these photos is going to hold more water? Top, who raised their hand for top? Who raised their hand for bottom? Yay, excellent, absolutely. But they didn't do the same thing at the same time, right? It started out not doing very well, and just with a simple change in management, providing rest and alternative water, in this case for livestock, it was able to rebound quite quickly, like within 4 years. Rain helps when we're making a management change, always when it comes in timely, that's great. And when the pieces are all still there, the soil, the seed bank is still in the soil, there's still opportunity, then these riparian areas are quite resilient and they can rebound. So healthy riparian areas have a variety of plant species in them, both species-wise as well as heights and structures. They've got to have little trees to replace the big trees. The roots are deep in the plants that are growing there, so typically native species. Very few, if any, invasive plants. Few, if any, disturbance-caused plants, so Kentucky bluegrass or brome, or even some of the species that Keegan was talking about are great in an upland situation. But once they get into our riparian area, that starts to change the way that riparian area is going to function. Because those plant species have different defining root capacities, and they may not respond to the non-moisture. So very little bare ground or altered banks, and the ability to flood frequently. Riparian areas are called a floodplain or a shoreline for a reason, right? They're the release valve for getting that water out of the channel and out onto the floodplain where it can be utilized. So streams that are healthy are going to have that meandering, snaking capacity across the landscape. That's going to help them maintain their function. I like that old pickup truck. As I mentioned, slowing down the water, getting out onto a wide area, slows that water down, drops any sediment it might be carrying with it so that the plants on the land can utilize it. Because sediment within the channel, is going to create other plants to grow that we might not want, right? Algae or things like that. That because of the phosphorus attached to that sediment could also affect fish habitat, right? That sediment could be settling out within the channel and smothering, for example, fish spawning habitats and things like that. When we straighten or ditch or change the way that water moves, by increasing that water, we've essentially increased the amount of erosion it's gonna do, which can ultimately result in cutting down through a field or just cutting down within the channel valley itself. And ultimately, the faster the water moves off, the less we have the ability to utilize it. So I love that Keegan used the sponge analogy, because we do too, as far as riparian areas go, and similar idea for us, where we're talking about those wetland and riparian floodplains and valley bottoms. When the sponge is healthy, the soils are loose, they're porous, water can soak in, sit and stay, and then move through also afterwards. So that when, we do have a dry time, that water can be released from groundwater out to keep our streams perennial or our lakes, with water in them. When we compact that sponge, whether it's through, whatever activity we might be doing that essentially compacts and squishes those soil pores, that water runs off and doesn't have the chance really to be beneficial to those of us that need it. So faster water, more erosion, less of it. And that also relates to the water quality piece. So when we've got healthy riparian areas, they are going to be dealing with what we call good mud. So the good mud is the mud that is on the land with the nutrients where things can grow. The bad mud is the mud that gets, or the soils and sediments that get left in that channel and aren't growing anything for you guys that might be wanting to grow things. And then could be also affecting some of that aquatic habitat as well. So all of that is related to not only habitat and good growing conditions for cattle and grass, but also for the fish that are in that channel. So we talk about riparian areas and that sponge again, there's this idea about making investments. So taking advantage of the rain when we get it, so that we can utilize it later on and sort of withdraw from that bank. We might not physically withdraw from it, but the natural systems will. So by contributing to that, that healthier water supply, this does not work on this TV, I keep forgetting, being able to slow that water down, let that flood happen, give it the space to do it, slow it down, soaks in, recharges that groundwater aquifer. So that later on, if we don't get the amount of rain, or whether it's in the same year or a future year, that that bank or that water investment is there to be withdrawn to maintain our aquatic habitat, maintain water for livestock. Unhealthy side, all that just happens so much faster, and there's just less in the bank to utilize. And this is sort of a great little diagram that sort of just illustrates that in a different way. When we think about riparian areas, not only around their own little wetland or your own little farm, think about it on a watershed scale too, even as big as the Athabasca Basin sometimes. Right? If you've got wetlands and riparian areas on streams and rivers intact, we're still going to have floods in the spring. We're still going to have peaks, but it's going to be slower. The blue line across the middle, slower, still going to peak, and ultimately we're going to end up with more water at the end. Whereas if we've got water going off the landscape as fast as we can, we get those really flashy floods, flashy systems, sometimes high damage scenarios, and that water is gone. And then we've got less to work with. So more water in the reserve ultimately means more reliable water supply for livestock, watering as well as irrigation or whatever you might be growing for pastures or crops, either native or tame. And streams and rivers will run longer, lakes and wetlands remain more full and have less dramatic fluctuations. So more water typically translates into more forage. So riparian areas, when they're in healthy condition, are just going to grow more food and more opportunities for grazing. So primary productivity is everything from that livestock feed source, as well as the biodiversity pieces. And it also lends itself to things like shade, shelter, moderating stream temperatures. So we talked about, moderating soil temperatures, but having that overhanging vegetation and having areas for water to move through sort of lower stream temperatures as well. Helps with carbon sequestration and also helps with connecting habitats as well. In a landscape as fragmented as ours is, even the littlest creatures are having a tough time getting from one place to the other to increase their genetic diversity and things like that. So having healthy riparian areas starts to connect some of those things as well. So there's a lot of variety found in these riparian lands. And again, that lends itself to the resiliency piece that we sort of touched on. But 80% of all the wildlife in Alberta rely on a riparian area for all or part of their life cycle. Whether they're raising young, passing through, needing shelter, and 100% of the fish rely on these riparian areas as well. And so that just connects everything. And the more variety of things that we have, again, improves that resiliency. And having that biodiversity can also lead to some pretty cool alternative or diversification opportunities too on farm. If you've got a wetland with great habitat, maybe you invite people to come on and look at some birds. Or maybe you've got fish and there's fishing opportunities, things like that. So on-farm tourism, hunting or fishing are something that you might be able to expand with. And so when we're talking about the pollinating things, because all of that biodiversity includes everything from, everything that's little right up to everything that's big. These pollinators require habitat throughout the season. And if you've got a diversity of shrubs, this is a bunch of different shrubs on the left and shows their flowering periods. So you've got a diversity of plants growing in your riparian lands, then you're going to have a diversity of flowering opportunities, diversity of pollinating habitats.
Where can we get going with that?
This, the Agroforestry and Woodlot Extension Society, also known as AWES, AWES. I believe this is and some information on their website.
If I can find it, I can email it out to everybody.
Yeah. So Agroforestry Woodlot Extension Society, I think it's oz-ab.ca. And it's all a lot of your native shrubs, so everything from, cranberry, chokecherry, willow, alder, those sorts of things. And so if you've got these overlaps throughout the year, then you're able to maintain some of that flowering habitat. And this is the slide that Keegan was referring to, that shows all the different bee genera on the left, and these are their foraging times. So they're not just foraging at one time of the year, they're going all throughout the season. And the yellow part is when canola flowers. So if we've got a landscape full of canola, those bees are going to be limited for a period of time when they require foraging from April all the way through to September, depending on the species. So again, adding to that diversity, they're definitely going to be helping pollinate that, all of our different crops out there, but if that's all we've got, they're going to be limited. This is also from our friends at Oz. And if we're talking water, beaver got to come into this conversation as well, because they and their busyness create a lot of riparian habitat and a lot of places where there's water. They slow it down, they store it, they promote the growth of willow and aspen. They ultimately create riparian habitats everywhere, even some places we don't want them. But there's definitely research out there that supports their value for getting us through droughts. So this is an example where a study was done between the 1950s, I want to say, and the 2000s. So 1950s in the area east of Edmonton, kind of by Elk Island National Park, beaver were sort of extirpated from the landscape and no longer there, and it was a dry year. This study looked at air photos from that year versus early 2000s, where beaver has sort of been, I would say they've been on the comeback for maybe 40 years or so. And it was drier than those early years, and there was ninefold more water on the landscape in the early 2000s, just because beaver were back. So a lot of that open water, or any water that was found that people were using for livestock or using for watering other things, was coming out of those beaver ponds. And there's also really great evidence and research coming out about the impacts of beaver and fire. Dr. Emily Fairfax has done some work out of the California fire and the big Ohio and Oregon fires, I think, that happened a few years ago. And this is just some imagery that shows that where the beaver dam was and the beaver pond was, that vegetation essentially survived that fire. It created a fire break, was just, more moisture, less intense. It's the exact same system, just a little ways over where there was that beaver and impounded water was not there, just run right through it. And there's also evidence that these beaver dam areas become refuges for other wildlife in these fire situations. So they've got somewhere to go to sort of make it through.
They also lead to faster regeneration because that seed bank is there. And
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And so there are a variety of tools out there that can sort of help maintain some of these benefits of beaver on the landscape, but also mitigate some of the challenges that they pose. So we know they flood places, we know they block things, we know that they take down trees, but there are some tools out there, and they're getting more, getting more popular to start to try to sort of maintain them on the landscape, but mitigate the issue. So for example, a pond leveler is a water regulation device that, when put in a beaver dam, can help move water that might be flooding a field in the summer, and get it down to a height that's manageable, and kind of keep both in place. Now, unfortunately, these things are not things that people can just go out on the landscape and do. There is some, regulatory things around doing these types of things in water, particularly with pond levelers and maybe these types of combo devices on culverts. But if you want to know more about that, there's a great website called workingwithbeavers.ca, where you can explore some of that, or you can talk to myself or Nancy afterwards if you want to know more about that. We got a whole talk on that topic, so if you want to spend another half a day with us, we could do talk about beavers. So in the end, the ability of a particular stream, wetland, or watershed, to perform those superpowers or those ecological functions is ultimately going to come down to how healthy or unhealthy a site is. And so we do have some metrics to help people determine that. So it's called riparian health assessment or riparian health inventory. And ultimately it's a look at the different vegetation factors and some of the different soil factors and moisture factors that then ultimately give you a score or a rating that measures, how well your riparian area is performing those functions. So if you're sort of scoring less than 60%, the site is going to be unhealthy and not performing the functions very well, but that doesn't mean that all is lost. It just might take a little longer for things to come back. If it's healthy but with problems, there's a ranging in there from 60 to 80% through the scoring metric. You probably got some things that are working, some things maybe not. And depending on how the management changes, it could go either red or green over time. And then the sort of the healthy end is a scoring of 80% to 100%, which means that you've got that diversity, you've got the trees and shrubs that are supposed to be growing there, your soils are they're not compacted, there's not a lot of impacts, even though it might still be for use or used for something. So this is a tool that Calvin Fish has. We've also got some sort of just producer friendly materials that you can take home and get a sense of things yourself as well. So does it make sense to invest in riparian areas? particularly from a water quality standpoint. This is not new research, this is not anything that you may not have seen before, but I think it's just a good reminder, and people are saying it even more these days, is that livestock on cleaner water are gonna drink more, graze more, and ultimately way more. And it's used to just be science, but there's definitely lots of producers that are seeing this as well. And then the other element on the economic side is bringing the water to the cattle instead of the cattle to the water. Less foot rot, less bag issues, less vet costs and animal costs, which all is great for the pocketbook, right? So if we wanna start thinking about how you're gonna get to some of that, we like to talk about the range management principles. So the range management principles apply in uplands as well as riparian areas, but essentially they're around balancing your animal demand with your forage supply, so that's your stocking rates and carrying capacities, distributing your livestock throughout the land base as opposed to just letting them go kind of where they want, avoiding grazing during volatile times, like for example the spring, and then also providing growing season rest. So I thought that was actually really interesting because those principles we've been talking about for years, the range management principles that have been going on for years. And the responses to drought that producers tend to have are either proactive or reactive. And you're either in it and have to make some decisions, or you're thinking ahead. And from a interesting just sort of paper that I found, the reactive ways of dealing with drought and responding to drought are purchasing feeds, applying for assistance, reducing the herd size like tomorrow, or weaning early. If you're being proactive, you're thinking about how can I give my pasture rest? How can I have banked forage so that if my upland pastures are drying out and not producing very well, could I use my riparian areas for something? Identifying the animals to sell ahead of time to reduce that stocking rate, to be able to sort of balance what the grass is going to be able to grow with limited moisture, and that then relates to conservative stocking rates. So how does riparian area fit into that? So we are not cows or fish, we're cows and fish. So we see that there's benefit to utilizing riparian areas at certain times if the principles are followed. So thinking about if you've got a healthy condition riparian area, it's going to work better for grazing through a drought. You can graze or hay a lot of these riparian lands for that 1, maybe 2 seasons. Hopefully it doesn't last much longer than that. Considering stocking rates to ensure that you're not taking too much in those years and leaving that carrying capacity behind. Definitely providing alternative water, because if the wetland is dried up, you might not have a water source. So you either need to have a well or a dugout or somewhere else that you can maybe provide water through. Watching for overuse on certain plant types, and then definitely providing rest in the growing season where you still can, so through that rotation, even in a dry year, and then thinking about following years. If you use it this year, are you able to let it rest next year? And then also considering that there's other things that are using that landscape, so what are the nesting times? Well, what else might be using it? Grazing generally after August 1st, July 15th to August 1st. So the one thing to keep in mind is that long use periods will stress out those riparian areas. So even if we use it in a dry time, keep doing that, it's going to end up, just productivity is just going to go down, just like any other pasture. So being able to provide that rest, create better distribution, allow those plants to grow, and minimize use in the vulnerable periods. So the balancing animal demand with available resource, that's essentially what do you have, what do you need, what's your carrying capacity, so what can you leave behind to do things like keep the soil covered, trap moisture, that sort of thing. What is that? Can you find a balance in that? And I don't know if anybody does the math on your guys, if you've got farms around, do you actually do the math? You know, like what area do I have, how many animals do I need, like grazing days, all that? Are you guys into that? Yeah, some of you might do it just in your head naturally, you know, just from experience as well. But doing those calculations can be really helpful to let you know if you maybe should be stopped earlier or what you know, maybe you need more land base for a certain year. Thinking about riparian areas, although they're definitely valuable to carry us through drought times, but they also, like I said, they have to be healthy enough to do that. So being able to let them be wet when the conditions are such is going to sort of help that riparian area do all of the things throughout the year. So avoiding sensitive times like spring or after heavy rains, that when soils are most susceptible to compaction, whether it's by livestock or vehicle, letting them just be wet and do their thing is going to help carry through more healthy the season. And that will grow more grass, and that's where you can stockpile forage. So if you defer use in those riparian lands, then that will help. Also thinking about wintertime, you can winter graze riparian lands sometimes, but you got to watch the use on the willows and the woody plants, because the willows and woody plants are actually pretty tasty for livestock in the winter, and doing that too many years in a row without enough rest can start to deplete their reserves. So we get to work with a lot of ranchers at Cows and Fish that teach us a lot. And this is Sean McGrath from Round Rock Ranching out by Vermilion. And his at a drought workshop previously, one of our colleagues was there, and he basically said the most important thing you can do in a drought is shut the dark gate. You're not trying to save cows, you're trying to save plants. And if we take Keegan's message, we're also trying to save soils. So in a nutshell, this reflects the principles of balancing animal demand with available supply at different times. It's all fine and dandy to do rotational grazing, but if the animals are always going back to that riparian area for water, for example, then it doesn't really help. And this situation, similar thing. So considering providing full pasture rest for a season or multiple seasons is one way that you can create backup forage. So if there's a spot that you could just let grow for a couple of years, that could set you up to have some flexibility in these dry times. So well, I can go over there, I got some grass I can graze in there and let something else rest. So it's about being proactive, about planning ahead if you can, and giving yourself that flexibility. So using riparian areas as part of rotational grazing systems, one of the best ways to do that is through fencing like with like. So if you've got plant communities that are similar, that riparian area versus an upland field, if you can divide those into two separate pasture units, you're going to be able to use them at different times. So the concept of there's different ways of utilizing fencing as a tool. You can do it as a riparian pasture, you could do corridor fencing, but we find that the riparian pasture is the most flexible. So if you do, so this is the riparian pasture is essentially a wider fenced riparian area. So it's wide, it's fenced wide enough that the field is large enough that you can utilize it. And then you can work it into a rest rotation. If you do go for sort of an exclusion or a corridor fencing type situation, so this would be where you might fence narrower to a stream. It doesn't give you as many options, but it will still protect that bank area from livestock. The biggest thing though is remember that streams and rivers move. So there's another value to putting your fence further back. Because a big flood or a big rain or something is eventually going to wash that fence out and wash that investment out. So that's another value in thinking about fencing wider. And as you're making grazing plans this year, think about fall. even, start thinking about fall now. Because there's, again, some research by people like, Dr. Bork out of the University of Alberta. That, shows that if you can plan for better pasture condition in the fall, the pasture will recover from being utilized, from being grazed. And that ultimately has to do with the types of plants that are out there. And the deeper the plant root, the more energy that it can have to keep it through the winter, to kickstart it back in the spring. So that's kind of the old adage of, again, living off the interest as opposed to dipping into your capital. So there's all these fun banking analogies when we're thinking about range management. And it's a similar sort of idea. You start to dip into your capital of your grass resource, and ultimately, the roots get shorter, right? They just can't tap into that groundwater anymore, because they don't have that solar panel, they're not photosynthesizing, and they're just relying on root reserves. Classic research example showing, no grazing to very little grazing to heavy grazing on the right. And what's going on above ground is definitely reflected below ground, just in the root mass. So another quote from Sean. When we met Sean, we were very, very pleased. He's got lots of really cool insights to how he's grazing and managing his ranch. And basically saying that litter is part of your rain barrel out on the field. Because leaving that thatch behind, leaving something behind, just provides something for moisture to slow down and soak in, cools the soil, all those things. And typically, pastures with more litter will produce more. And definitely grasslands with out litter produce less. So the other piece when we're thinking about riparian land and incorporating them into the grazing system is where are the animals going to get sheltered? Right? Lots of times the riparian area, depending on the type of landscape you're in, that's the only place that's got trees or shrubs where they can get out of the shade or get out of the bugs. So keeping in mind that that might be a use for that riparian area, can you add other tools to the mix? A portable shelter. Do you have multiple places that they could go? Do they always have to go back to the same one all the time? Having multiple options is going to help with some of that too. And ultimately ensure the riparian area is not the only place for shelter in that pasture unit. And then lastly, I think one that people have heard about a lot, that's moving cows to water, or moving water to cows instead of cows to water. So this is using that alternative watering system, whatever it might be, everything from a nose pump to a solar system to a geothermal, whatever you want to use. Idea being, bring that water up to a spot that reduces the impact on the riparian area. Even if you've got a watering system, putting it right next to the wetland or right next to the creek or river isn't necessarily going to meet all the needs. Right? That manure buildup is going to end up right in. They're going to trample still some of those areas. 2 out of the 10 cows are still going to go down into the creek, which is not huge. It's better than the 10 out of 10. But typically the research and experience shows that about 8 out of 10 are going to go to that watering trough as opposed to down to the watering system if it's placed appropriately. And again, that providing a heavier weight gain at weaning time is also going to be one of the ultimate payoffs of that. So there are different funding systems out there, funding resources out there to help support these watering systems or different grazing systems. And not only are there benefits for the livestock, but you can increase flexibility. Right? If you've got a portable one and that works for you, you can move it to different places. If you've got a permanent one, maybe you can feed multiple pastures, into that one. Gives you better livestock health and also just maintains the water supply. Less siltation, particularly in dugouts too. You've got an off-stream water that might be for a dugout that might be fenced, pumping out of it. You should have to clean that dugout out less. Should last longer. So a bunch of different sort of distribution tools are available that a lot of producers are using to help sort of take that pressure off the riparian area, allow them to do their thing when it's appropriate for them to do so. So where you feed, how you feed, where you put your salt, where your mineral is. Moving those things away from, the water is gonna help. And whether you use fencing, whether you use permanent fencing, temporary fencing, and then again, permanent water, temporary water. And if the odd cow, you know, is grazing, or we think that these riparian areas, can be grazed, just again, thinking about timing, distribution, and, balancing the stocking rates. This is just another example of sort of how changes in management can influence riparian areas. So this, is down in the Dog Pound Creek, so kind of that, west of Red Deer, southwest of Red Deer area. So this one, where that fence was, they initially put it up too close. So it lasted for a few years, but ultimately when it was time to replace it, they moved it back. And after, what's that? I don't know, good math, my math's not so great. 50-ish years or so, you can see how the shrubs and the grasses started to rebound back when there was hardly any of that left. And they don't think they did any extra planting in there or anything like that. So that diversity was still in that soil bed. It just needed some chance to rest and pop up. So just because it was dry one year, doesn't necessarily mean it's gonna be the next. So consider planning accordingly. And if you have a memory like I do, take pictures. What did it look like in 2023? So that you can know what it's gonna look like in 2025, or you can relate back. And so, you know, with that riparian health that I touched on, and where you kind of have a measurement or a score, is you can look at a site in, say, 2002, see where it was in those particular conditions. It's probably dry that year. And go back and repeat that assessment 5, 10, 15 years later and see sort of what's changed. And in this case, the overall score went from a healthy but with problems up to healthy in a little over 15 years. Some things are really difficult to change, so things like invasive plants. If you got Canada thistle in there in 2002, you're probably still gonna have Canada thistle in 2016. But it's all these other things like, you know, maybe, physical alterations, trailing, maybe those things have grown over and are no longer an issue. Or veg cover, had a lot of bare ground one year and less the next. So it's not just us that are talking about these things, producers are talking about it as well. One of our colleagues has been doing sort of a long-term work with Red Deer County on some of their Alice projects. And a lot of them are involving fencing, off-stream water to essentially provide those 4 principles for the riparian habitats. And basically, what those producers are saying is, they're seeing the water retention, they're seeing a more stable water supply. Birds. Less foot rot, better udders, increased forage production, lower grade land producing more. So there's a practical application to some of these things as well. So there's lots of different ways to achieve these riparian, healthy riparian areas, whether you're trying to maintain one or shifting it from maybe a less healthy condition. But ultimately, time and space is what you're gonna need, and a little bit of help from moisture. And being able to hold and keep that moisture on the landscape. So in the end, it comes down to choices. We're given these different options. What are we gonna do with these different options, and where are we gonna go? Are we gonna keep living in the margins? We can, but we're gonna end up on there with the alligators. So some of the different funding and support opportunities that are available out there to help with some of these grazing, particularly grazing management changes I'll talk about, but there's also, ways to buffer crop, wetlands that are in crop, or create, pollinator habitat around croplands. Sometimes Cows and Fish has some funding that we can work with you to do a project. The Resilient Agriculture Landscape Program, that's Drought, through the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership. That's the Government of Alberta, Government of Canada funding source that's out there right now that opened, I think, the new pot just a couple of months ago, so there should still be resources there for that program, but they'll help with watering systems, fencing, things like that. I put Athabasca Watershed Council, my bad. Sometimes you guys have funding projects, I'm not sure, I think you still do, right now, which we'll probably talk about, so they could be a resource. And then if you're looking for trees and shrubs, or help with enhancing that biodiversity, from that perspective, Agroforestry and Woodlot Extension Society is around for that too. And if, you're in Parkland County or Bradford County, you know, the Alice program is there, as well as some of the other locations too. Vermilion, also has one. So Cows and Fish, not-for-profit organization, but we do have a number of member and supporters, and I just want to mention them. Alberta Beef Producers, Trout Limited Canada are our founding partners, so Cows and Fish, they kind of go together that way. We have funding and in-kind resources, in-kind support through some of the Alberta government grants, as well as rural municipalities of Alberta, Canadian Cattle Association, and Association of Agricultural Fieldmen. And of course, all the producers and municipalities and community groups. Because ultimately, we're bringing information to you. So we can't do that if you're not asking for it. Or somebody like Amber's not putting it out there. She didn't even know you wanted the information. But Amber gave you the opportunity to come and find out. If you want to get a hold of us in Edmonton, there's 3 of us now. Myself, Nancy, and our colleague Christina. And you can check out our website as well. Also, we're on the social medias and the YouTube and all that good stuff.